And welcome back, and here we are with part 3 of building Gentoo via the handbook. The slow process. We're already an hour into our installation. Of course, that's with me talking a lot, and hopefully I'm giving you good information about this, and we will move on. So we look here at configuring the kernel, and the first thing that we're going to need to decide is what kind of kernel we're going to use. If you're going through this tutorial, then you're probably not that comfortable with the kernel, and what we're going to do is a fail-safe kernel, one that's going to work no matter what, so that we don't have to worry about configuring it to our specific system. Plus, since I'm in a virtual box to do this so that I can show you everything, it doesn't make sense to try to customize the kernel at this time. So the first thing we need to do is get the Gentoo sources. And the Gentoo sources are pretty much a set of kernel packages that have specific settings and everything in there to make it all pretty and work for Gentoo. If you've never installed Gentoo before, the Gentoo sources are the best way to go. You also have options for installing the vanilla sources and other types of kernel packages. And if you want to look at what those are, if you do an emerge-s and look up sources, that should, I believe, pull up all the different kernel sources that you can bring. So for instance, you've got Linux sources for virtualization. Actually, that's just virtualized. Ignore that. Sorry, I just started reading it without realizing. You've got the Zen sources. You've got Xbox sources, virtual server sources. There's the vanilla sources that would install 3.12.5. If we move up a little bit here, and you've got, and I'm sorry, I don't know what RT stands for out of the box, but it's a full Linux 3.10 kernel source with the config preempt RT patch. You've got your RSBAC kernel sources, which I'm not really familiar with. Here's Raspberry Pi sources. We move on up. There's a lot of different sources you can choose from, and that can be confusing and bothersome if you don't know what you're doing. The best thing to do is know that you can choose between your hardened sources and your Gentoo sources, and I would suggest for now sticking with Gentoo sources. We do an emerge, and even though they don't use it, I like to use the -AV Gentoo sources. And as I've said many times in other videos, the A stands for ask, the V stands for verbose. And I do that because I want it to always ask me when installing new packages to make sure that suddenly it's not going to pull in, say, the whole new KDE flavor or something like that on me, and I wanted just one package and I didn't want the whole dependency tree. So to be able to do Gentoo sources, it's going to install 2 files. It's going to install sysdevil, BC, and the sources itself. So we're going to say yes, allow that to occur. It's going to download them. It's not going to download them because I've lost network connectivity again. You guys are probably laughing at me with that. It's so dragging. Alright, so let me just pause this for a second. Get that. Okay, got my network going. It's now installing those sources. So we'll let that go. I should have just gone ahead and let it pause because it may take, it'll go pretty fast. It looks like it's already mostly done. BC is installed, and here comes the kernel sources here in a moment. While that does that, we will look at going down in our list a little bit more. The other thing that while this installs, I'm not going to do a default manual configuration. If you're interested in looking at the kernel, for time's sake and all that, look at some of my kernel Gentoo in review sessions and see if any of those help you out, and I'd be more than willing to assist you in that. And I do plan to do a vanilla kernel build if you wanted to add the vanilla kernel to your system, and I'll be going over that probably next year sometime. We're going ahead and getting those Gentoo sources. It's unpacking them. There's nothing really to compile at this time. It's just grabbing those sources. So that won't take too much longer. But once we do that, then we will verify that user source Linux is set proper, and we will move on. Another thing about that is that if you have multiple kernels installed on the system, then, or at least the sources, you can use eSelect kernel list to view them and eSelect kernel set to choose which ones, and those will change, and that will change the user source Linux to point to the right version of kernel that you're wanting to use. So it's just about done here, and we'll check that, and then we'll move on through with our next step. And this should only be a few seconds. I know, yeah, there we go. We should be done here in a moment. And like I said, we're going to skip the default manual configuration because this is to just get you going. This is, if you really want to know all the other stuff, look at some of the other kernel builds that I've done, and I will always be willing to at least attempt to assist you with doing those kernel builds if you're afraid. As a newbie or someone starting out with Gentoo and they just want to get in there and run it and play with it, I'm going to show you the configuration that's going to make it easiest for you. It may be a little bloated because it's going to install and look for hardware and build everything whether you need it or not. But when you're starting out, that's the best way to do it. That's what I did. I started out having it do this for me, and then eventually went to, okay, let's try building my own kernel without the assistance and pulling in just the drivers. And I would find, oh, this doesn't work, that doesn't work. So learn from experience and grow. That's the best way to do it. So we're all done here. It's now doing the syskernel finalization. And we're back here, so we do an ls-l/user source Linux, and we see that it's pointing to 3.10.17. That is the latest stable Gentoo sources. We move on over here. As it says here, if you were doing a manual configuration, you'd go into user source Linux, do the make menu config, and then the make command, but you have to configure all of this yourself, and that could take a little bit of time. So we're going to go to the alternative, and that's the nice thing about the handbook, is it explains everything. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to emerge the gen kernel. Now the gen kernel is an awesome package that will set everything up for us and build everything from scratch to a working kernel and put it into our boot area and everything else. Now what I want to do for this, and I should have done it for the last time, I want to use that time command so that we can see how long it really takes to set this part up. Well, it's going to fetch it and do this. To simplify things, I'm going to go ahead and pause the video so you don't have to sit there and just watch code go by. But this will give you an idea at the end how long it really took to get that going. Okay, so it says that it took about 2 minutes and 53 seconds. Actually, you got to subtract probably about 45 seconds to a minute while I sat there and just stared at it going, duh, oh crud, my network's off again, and it's not going to download it. Anyway, it downloaded it, got it down there, installed. We now have gen kernel. Now the great thing about gen kernel is you don't have to do anything but a simple gen kernel command, and we're going to do a time at the front of this. Time gen kernel and type all, because we want everything to be done. Now what this is going to do is going to build your kernel. It's going to use sources that are going to build everything. Now, if we go through here while that starts, it's going to compile your kernel sources by running the gen kernel all. Be aware though, as gen kernel compiles a kernel that supports almost all hardware, this compilation will take a bit of time. Note that if your boot partition doesn't use etc2 or 3 file system, you may need to manually configure your kernel using the gen kernel dash menu config all, which allows you first to go into the menu config and do any specifics that you need to do before it moves on. Now the nice thing about gen kernel all command is that this not only is going to build your kernel and all your modules and everything else, but it's also going to put everything in where it needs to do. It's going to create an init ramfs and init rd sort of file system for boot up, and it's going to make it nice and pretty and easy and bootable. And that's the most important thing when you're first starting out with Gentoo. Don't try to get into Gentoo and think that immediately you're going to customize it to make it exactly what you want, unless you're a Linux guy who's been using it and built your kernels before and are absolutely comfortable with all this. Because in the beginning, there's going to be a lot of little stuff you're just going to have to learn. And even if you learn it, you're going to forget it if you haven't done it for a while. Just like I learned a lot of new stuff again. I said, oh my, I forgot this when I had to rebuild my system a couple months ago. So we're going to let this go. We've got the time command on there, so it'll tell us when it's all done how long everything took. And there's no reason for me to continue. So to keep this short, we're going to go ahead and pause it again, and I'll let you know when we're back. Okay, and we are back. And it looks like everything completely finished. In real time, that took 28 minutes and 39 seconds, it looks like, with user time being 51 minutes. I'm not sure. Well, it took about 30 minutes to do all that stuff. I think user time is how long we've been actually in this flavor here doing stuff. About 51 minutes altogether. But it took 28 minutes to compile, build. That's not too bad. Half an hour of your life to set up that kernel. Now, one thing I did notice what it's doing here is it said something about how it was not something in here about the firmware. Not installing firmware as it's included in the kernel already. That's interesting because it's been a long time since I've done a gen kernel. And if we go on back over here and we do an ls/boot, we will see that it has put the init ramfs in there. It's put in the kernel and the system map. So we have our kernel, we have our our init system in there. Everything looks good. It built the kernel modules. I'm curious if we do an ls/lib/firmware. You see, I don't see much firmware in there other than it's all in the directories. So what I'm going to do next, and this isn't in the instructions here, but just because I know it's helped me in the past and it may help you, if you do an emerge, and I'm going to put that time in there so we can see how long it takes to do this. Time emerge -av linux-firmware. This has helped me in the past. So let's grab that and have it install real quick. It shouldn't take too much because there's really not much to compile. It's much like the kernel. It's just going to kind of put everything in there. And I've never tried it using the gen kernel, but we're going to see if that all works here. It didn't like it. Oh, okay. I see what it's saying here. What it's saying is that these are file collisions that it's going to have. So maybe it is the same stuff. Maybe we didn't really need to do that. My bad. Sorry. 50 seconds. It all is still good. You can ignore that what I just did. It won't hurt anything. We move on. Please ignore what you see behind the curtain. Kernel modules. Let's see here. We're not going to worry too much about kernel modules for right now because everything kind of loaded without us having to set anything up. Now we move on to configuring your system file system information. This is where we're going to set up the FS tab, or your file system tab, and configure that. So what we need to do is we do a nano-w/etc fs tab, and this is your file system. This is what I don't like with how some places they put some sort of drive ID here and you can't figure it all out. We don't have to worry about boot, so we can get rid of that line. But we need to set up the root, and if you remember, the root was SDA2, and we also did that as etc4. Our swap partition, if you remember, we did SDA1, and the rest of it looks good. We can leave. I like to change this to SR0 because that seems to be more in line a lot of times. Sometimes the UDev will see us DVD as /dev/DVD. Sometimes it will see DVD-RW. Sometimes you'll see dev CD-ROM. I find that everything always points to SR0, so I set that up. We don't have a floppy, so we can get rid of the floppy option as well. And those are the main important spots. And once again, you know, I get rid of some of the stuff that doesn't need to be in here. Clean it up just a wee bit. You can always leave in your comments that are in there if you think you might need them. I don't particularly care for some of them because they don't make sense to me. I don't need to use them. This goes on. It's going to give you some more information, such as, you know, if you need to have different user settings here. Well, that's pretty much all we have to do because this is a very simple setup. So we'll save it like that. Get back in over here. Control X. Yes to save. Close. We move on to the networking information. Now we're going to have to edit the host name. So do a nano-w/etc conf.d, which configuration, and net. Oops, I skipped a step. We'll get to that. Host name first. There we go. Now we want to change our host name to something else. So let's call this Gentoo, just because of Das Gregor. Save it. And then if we move on, this is where we're going to set up our network. So we want to edit conf.d net, and this blank configuration will automatically use DHCP for any net.star script in the init.d. To create more complete configurations, please review your user shared document on OpenRC net.examples for your configuration. So because of this, you don't really need to do anything. It will get set up automatically. So we can pretty much ignore these couple things here and go on to creating your network. And we don't need to set a lot of this. If we want to use DHCP, nothing really needs to be done here. Pretty much what I'm saying. So for this example, we're going to do that. We're going to just use DHCP. So we're going to leave that alone. And we move on down, and what we're going to do now is we're going to go into that etc init.d. This is where this script here is talking about. We're going to go into there, and if you do an ls, you can see some basic scripts. And you're going to see the net.low. Now, because if we do an if config right now, this shows us ENP0S3, If we don't want that, we want it to be ETH0, which for me I like much better. What we want to do before we set this up is what I wrote up here in this corner in my notes. We want to do an ln-s/dev/null, and we're going to create a shortcut link to that to etc udev rules.d, and we're going to call it 80-net-slot-rules. And up here, for some reason, I think I started writing, not realizing I was still in there. Now on the reboot, what that's going to do is that should make that ENP0S3 look like ETH0 again. So because it's going to do that, we can go ahead and create our link in here to be what we want it to be. Make sure I'm in there. Once again, I'm writing. Dash, we're going to do a symbolic link like it says, and we're going to do net.low to net.eth0. We do an ls, we'll now see that there is a symbolic link for net ethernet 0 to, and if we did ls-lsa, which I like, we can see all of our shortcuts, and you can see eth0 is pointing to net.low. Now this is where I gave some of you guys some information, and I didn't realize they'd change these names to kind of host things a bit, but by creating that rule, that will put things back to where things look nicer. The next thing we want to do is make sure that that's going to start up automatically. So we do an RC update. We want to add that net.eth0 to the default boot so that it starts automatically on boot. Now if you wanted to do SSH default, you do the same thing. RC-update add SSHD then to boot or default. And any of these scripts in here that you want to run automatically, you can set them up using that RC update add and then putting the rest there. So that makes it so network will start up automatically. We now need to set up and run our host file. So we do a nano-w/etc hosts, and you'll see there's a whole bunch of stuff in there. What we want to do is we want to run down here to the 127.0.0 because that's always your home, and you want to edit that. We called ours DOS Gentoo, so we'll throw DOS Gentoo in there. Now if you're going to do a domain name and all that, then you can add the domain. Otherwise we're not going to do that. We're just going to call localhost and DOS Gentoo being 127.0.0.1. Now any other computers on your system that you might want to set up for a local host, you can do that. I tend to just point at the IP addresses. And we move on. We save that. Get out of it. Now here's where if you had hardware that you're going to need to use, like PCMCIA slots, we don't have that here in this one, then you would install the emerged PCMCIA utils. This also is where you can go ahead and emerge, and we will set a time so we can see how long it takes. This is where you want to emerge PCI utils though, and maybe USB utils. I'm pretty sure those are the ones. And I forgot to use my -AV because I like doing that. So let's have that. It's going to check the dependencies, make sure there's nothing else that it may need to install. The next thing while it does that, I'm going to go over is it's having you change your root password. But we changed our root password at the beginning because if you're going to do a secure shell into it, you're going to need to know what that root password is. And as you can see, there's a whole bunch of junk in there that I didn't like looking at. Let's take a look here. It's going to install a lot of stuff, and it looks like 71 packages, 4 upgrades, 65 new, 1 in a new slot, 1 reinstall. But we have some problems. It's saying here, for instance, that multiple package instances within a single package slot have been pulled into the dependency graph, resulting in a slot conflict. So we have some problems here with the Gentoo kmod and some other issues. But we're going to ignore installing PCI utils and USB utils until possibly after the reboot to get us further along, because a lot of the stuff might be resolved after we actually boot into the kernel. So for now, let's get into our system where we need to update rc.conf, which is our next step. So we'll do -w/etc rc.conf. Now this is where you're going to set some things such as when it boots up, do you want it to start multiple things at once in parallel, which means that different init scripts will run at the same time. You can set that to yes if you wanted that to happen. You can go in here and set this to yes if you want to be interactive. Now I do like that because sometimes I need to say don't run a script, so I hit the I button at the beginning and it lets me set it to interactive, and then it'll ask me for each init script whether or not I want to run it or ignore it, and that really helps you out. This is also where you can set up things that you don't want to run so that it'll ignore them in the scripts. For instance, if you have your wireless LAN net and your ETH0 and you use wireless all the time, you may want to make sure that net.eth is not set automatically ever to run, whether it has an RC update or not. So go through it, look at it, read it. Really, there aren't that many other things inside of it you need to worry about anymore. Most of it's default. If you want to set up logging, though, that's always a good thing. You can come in here and you can tell it RC logger, turn it on, and then make sure you uncomment where the path is going to be in var log rc.log. And therefore, if you have any problems with when it's booting up, you can look at that RC log and actually see what it's doing and be able to fix that. For now, we'll just save it with the few choices I did. We move on to key maps. So we nano-w/etc conf.d, and we want to look at key maps. Now, most people are going to say yes. If you have whatever key map you're using for your country, you want to change that. We're using US. Windows keys, because it's most computers that are for Windows have the Windows keys, so yes to that. If you're in Europe and you need it to do the fixed euro, you want to change that to yes. And that's pretty much all you need to do. There are a few other things in here that you can look at. We didn't change anything, so that's why I did that. And we move on. The hardware clock. Now this is where you're going to set it to local or UTC. Now right now we changed our time, but it's still thinking that it's UTC. So we go in here to ETC and then conf.d and HW clock, and we want to change this clock equals local, because I never like using UTC time. And that's really the only thing you have to change in here that I can think of. So we save that. And we're on option 9, installing necessary system loggers and such. So we want to do a time emerge-av syslog-ng. See what that will do first, and let's see how we're doing on time. And we're almost up to 30 minutes, so let's go ahead and get that one installed here. And I'll be pausing it anyway because my network's turned off again. I need a new laptop. Okay, and I got the network back up, and it only took about 3.5 minutes to install that. So then we do an rc-update, add, and that's the syslog-ng to default. Excuse me, my throat there. And then it also asks us if we want to install them. These are optional, but I find them to be highly suggestible. So we want to do another one. This is a cron daemon. So we're going to do an emerge-av. Now it's interesting. I always thought they had us use vcron, but in this example they're telling us to go ahead and install crony, or crony, or if I can spell it. Cron IE could be too, or crony. And we're going to go ahead and throw in the mlocate as well, just to kind of throw two birds in with one stone here for indexing, because that's always useful as well. We're going to do that, let that go through, and it's going to take up those, it's going to be 3 things. So yes, go ahead, and I'll pause the video again because there's no sense in you guys watching the compilations. Okay, that only took a minute, so then we do an RC update on that and add that as well. Add crony default. I also like, with the remote access, I was kind of scrolled up a little bit here. We want to go ahead and set up the SSD, so rc-update, add SSHD to default, so that will work. Now if you have serial ports, you're going to want to look at this init tab and set up serial ports the way you need to. And then the next section here we're going to get into is file system tools. But for right now, we are at 30 minutes, and I'm going to go ahead and stop it, and we'll start with part 4 in a moment.